Firstly, I want to stress that it's great to see everybody, and obviously it's much better in person, but we'll take what we can get, as they say. So with that in mind, we'll start the show. Okay. Obviously Shmitah is a huge topic, and there's no way really to cover the entire topic. That's not possible. But I'm going to try and at least introduce the topic of Shemitah, and I'm going to try to help people understand, I think, what some of the current issues are. And after people understand what the current issues are, then I think people can understand what their options are as well. And to that extent, I think, just to make it a little bit easier, I'm going to share the screen, and I'm going to share with you some sources that talk about Shemitah. And really, it's not so obvious how many sources that we have that discuss Shemitah. You'll see on this page there look to be 4 sources, but when we look at them carefully, we might find that in reality it's only 3 sources, maybe 4. So with that in mind, let's take a look. And I think also, once we look at the sources, it helps us to give us a picture as to what the Torah's attitude towards Shemitah is. The first source, and I listed them as they appear in order in the Chumash. That is to say, I started, the first place was in Mishpatim, and then I proceeded from there ultimately to Parshas Bahar, and then to Parshas Re'eh. So I kind of went in order, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it makes sense to look at the sources in order. It does make sense to begin with the first location, which is in Parshas Mishpatim, where we read, "V'sheish shanim tizras artzecha," 6 years you will sow the land, you will plant the land, "Yasaftas tuasa," and you will gather its produce. Okay, easy enough. V'hashvius, and in the 7th year, tishmitena unitashta. These are difficult words to translate. But we generally translate them as, in the 7th year you shall leave them unharvested and untended to. We'll get back to what these 2 words mean in a moment. V'achlu evyonei amecha, and the poor people of your nation will eat from them. V'yisrom, and the remainder, tochal chayas hasadeh, the beast of the field will eat them. Kain taseh, so shall you also do, not only for your fields that produce, let's say, grain and the like, but also l'charmecha, also to your vineyard, l'zeisecha, and to your olive orchard. Now, these words, tishmetena unitashta, as I said, are difficult to understand. What does it mean that they should be left unharvested and untended to? So Rashi understands that tishmetena suggests a prohibition of working the land. Not allowed to work the land. You gotta leave it fallow, as they would say. Unitashta, that means that you're not allowed to eat what comes from the land. The Ramban takes a different approach, and he understands that tishmetena refers to a prohibition specifically against planting, against zriya, and unitashta suggests that there is an obligation to leave the land ownerless, so that others can come and take from its bounty in order to eat from it. The Ibn Ezra, he takes the view that the word tishmetena, coming from the word Shemitah, has a technical application. We only apply that word, as we will see later on, to Shemitah's ksafim, to rendering debts null and void. And therefore, in this context, it refers to the fact that if someone owes you money, then by Torah law, the 7th year declares that those debts are canceled. We have a mechanism for overcoming that, where we take our debts and we assign those debts to Bezdin. That's called prusbul. Some people already signed a document at the beginning of the year and will do so at the end of the year as well. Others only do it at the end of the year. And Unatashta, according to the Ibn Ezra, suggests a prohibition against planting. Okay, but this is one source, straightforward source. I'd like to skip to source number 3 on the page in Parshas Bahar. This source, this first 7 psukim in the 25th chapter of Parshas Vayikra, read as follows: Vayidaber Hashem Moshe Bahar Sinai Lemor, and Hashem spoke to Moshe at Har Sinai, saying, Daber al bnei Yisrael v'amarta alehem, speak to the Jewish people and say to them, Ki savo ala aretz, when you come to the land, asher ani nosei lachem, which I give to you, v'shavsa haaretz shavas lashem, and the land shall rest a Sabbath to Hashem. There's a Shabbos that we observe every 7 days, and every 7 years there's a Shabbos for the land. And the description goes on further. Sheish shanim tizra sadecha, 6 years you shall plant your field. V'sheish shanim tizmar karmecha, and 6 years you will prune your vineyard. V'yasaftas tvasa, and you will gather its produce. V'ashana shviyas, and in the 7th year, Shabbos Shabboson Yeh la'aretz, it will be a year, it will be a time of rest. Shabbos Lashem, a Sabbath to Hashem. Sadko lo sizra, your field you shall not plant. V'charmecha lo sizmar, and your vineyard you shall not prune. Eis sviach kitzircha, the aftergrowth of what you harvest, lo siktzar. This is a very important halacha, as we'll talk about a little bit later on. The idea that there are things that might automatically grow on their own in the 7th year, or towards the end of the 6th year and into the 7th year. And that aftergrowth, lo siktzar, you shall not harvest. Ves invei nazirecha lo siftzar, and the grapes you shall not set aside that and pick them. Shna Shabboson Yeh la'aretz, it is a year of resting for the land. Vaisa Shabbos haaretz lachem la'achla, and the resting of the land will be for you to eat, l'cha, for you, la'avdecha, and for your servant, la'masecha, and for your maidservant, l'schircha, and for your laborer, l'toshavcha, and for your resident, hagar mimach, that live with you. And it concludes, v'levahemtecha, and for your animal, v'lchaya, and for the beast, asher ba'atzecha, in your land, tiyeh kol tuasa le'achol, all of the produce will be to eat. Now, there are some major contrasts between these two sections, which give us, I think, a window into how we should understand the concept of Shmittah. What's the point of this mitzvah? We have a general principle, Ein darshina taima dekra. We don't try to understand the reasons for psukim. There's a danger that if we try to say that we know the reason for a pasuk, if the reason doesn't apply, we might say that the din doesn't apply. A classic example might be that there is a mitzvah to chase away the mother bird. So if a person says, oh, the only reason that we shouldn't chase away the mother bird, that we should chase away the mother bird, is that because we don't want to be cruel. It would be terrible if the mother bird saw us taking away the chicks, the eggs. So therefore, that's why we have to chase away the mother bird. So the Gemara says that if a person says that, Meshaskin also, that we quiet down such a person. In other words, if a person says, Al kan sipor yogi rachamecha, that on a nest your mercy extends, because nobody knows for sure what the reason for a mitzvah is. I'll give you a classic example in history, that there were Jews who said that the reason that we can't eat pork is because of tapeworm disease. But now that we have control and we can be assured that the pork that's sold in the marketplace does not have tapeworm disease, so it's permissible to eat pork. There were a lot of Jews who used that exact reasoning. So that's, of course, wrong and leads to a dangerous approach. So while we don't know the reasons for sure, nonetheless, we are supposed to try to learn and appreciate the possibilities of what we are being taught and the messages for sure. So we don't say that our understanding of the text that determines whether we'll observe it. We have to observe regardless of what we understand or not. But there are two, I think, very different ideas here. Let's look very closely at the language. What's the main concept in Mishpatim? Bear in mind, in Mishpatim, this section is in a list of mitzvos that deal with social responsibilities. A primary example, for example, is the obligation to return a lost object, to not swear falsely. Many other examples. So in this list is the Mitzvah of Shemitah, and there in Pasuk Yud Aleph, so after we read Vashvius, the 7th year, you have to leave it unharvested and untended to Shmittah and Tashta. The Torah essentially tells us why. V'achlu evyonei amecha, in order that the poor in your nation be able to eat. There is a social responsibility, and that social responsibility, therefore, has a hierarchy to it. First, you have to take care of the poor people in your midst, and then afterward, v'yisrom, and the leftover, to ochal chayas hasadeh, will the beast of the field eat. Kain ta'aseh l'char machol zesecha, so shall you also do to your vineyard and to your olive orchard. So the reason for this mitzvah is, yes, that we have to make sure that everybody is taken care of. By contrast, when we look at the section in Bahar, so we find that what the guiding principle here is not about taking care of the poor, but rather, as the pasuk stresses in pasuk Beis, that Rabbi Nizar speak to the Jewish people and tell them, Ki savo ha'aretz, when you come to the land asher ani nosein lachem, that I give to you, vishavsa ha'aretz Shabbos lashem. The land will rest a Shabbos, a Sabbath to Hashem. In other words, the mitzvah of Shemitah here, the stress is not about taking care of people and their needs, but rather about shvisas haaretz. There is an obligation to the very land itself. And I think it's noteworthy that we don't find in Parshas Bahar any word which derives from the word Shemitah. In other words, in Mishpatim we find Vashvius Tishmitena from the word lishmot, to eradicate or to get rid of. But in Parshas Bahar, everything is connected to the idea of Shabbos, of resting, and it's really connected to the need of the land rather than the needs of the people. And therefore, what is the stress in this section? The stress in this section is telling us that there are 4 categories of work that on a Torah level are prohibited. It's important because some things are only prohibited on a rabbinic level, and if something is only prohibited on a rabbinic level, there are leniencies that apply. What are the 4 prohibitions that are discussed over here? Zriya, planting; Zmira, pruning. It's interesting that the Pella Yoetz, it's a great ethical work. So he says that when we sing on Shabbos, we sing Zmiros. So what is a zemer? What is a song? We don't speak of singing shirot or shirim, but rather of Zmirot. And that's because a zemer comes from the word lizmor, to prune. Really good music is produced when you can get rid of static, when you can get rid of bad sounds. If you have perfect pitch, if you have perfect harmony, then you have a zemer. So zmira means to prune. And then there is the prohibition against ktsira, against harvesting, which is generally something that applies to fields where fruit grow, where there are grains. And then there's the prohibition against bitsira. Bitsira refers to picking. Generally, this is relevant to vineyards and to olive orchards. So 4 major categories of work, and described in the context of of what we see over here, and that is the obligation or the need of the land to rest. Now, moving along, we find in Parshas Re'eh that, let's look at source number 4, the source on the bottom of the page. So here we find Miket Sheva Shanim Ta'aseh Shmitah. At the end of 7 years, you shall make a remission. V'zeh davar Shmitah. This is the matter of the remission. Shemot kol bal mashe yadeh asher yasher b're'ehu. That any individual who basically is owed money, so he has to remit authority over the credit that he has over his friend. What does that mean? That means that basically, strictly by Torah law, that there is a cancellation of debts that takes place. That come year number 7, somebody can owe you a tremendous amount of money, and the Shmittah cancels it. Now, we have a mechanism to overcome this problem, because in the times of the Talmud already, in the times of the Mishnah, they were worried that if Shemitah cancels debts, then the economy is gonna suffer. That is to say, who's gonna lose out? The poor person is gonna lose out, because nobody's gonna want to lend money if come year number 7, the debt is canceled and you can't collect. So, Kidei shelo tinol delas b'fnei lovin, in order that the door not be slammed in the face of the borrower, they came up with a mechanism. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai developed the concept of pruzbul. Pruzbul means that, let's say somebody owes me money. So I'm worried that this year Shemitah, if I'm owed any money, then I'm not going to be able to collect it. So what do? I take the debt, the note that I have, and I give it over to a Bezdin. So now it's not mine. And Bezdin therefore has the right to collect the debt on my behalf. I sent out an email before Rosh Hashanah encouraging people to sign a pruzbul so that they should not have any problems. A person who has not yet done so should do so by the end of the year. There's a whole question as to when it should be done. Ideally, I think it should be done before the beginning of the Shemitah year and at the end of the Shemitah year. Others feel it only needs to be done at the end of the Shemitah year. But in any event, the pasuk goes on to say, "Lo yigos es re'ehu," a person should not press his friend, ve'es achiv, and his brother. Ki kara Shemitah l'Hashem. This is a time where basically he has called Shemitah to the year, and therefore debts are canceled. Es anachriti goes, a person has the right to collect debts from a non-Jew. But what you have that your brother owes you, strictly speaking on a Torah level, comes year number 7, the debt is canceled and you should let it be. Now here the Torah does not actually tell us why we have this law. However, a little bit later on, the Torah does basically say that if we are careful and we keep the halachos properly, then efes kiyev evyon, there will not be poor people amongst you. It's hard to believe that such a time will ever come. We believe that that's an aspect of the Messianic era, that there won't be poor people. But if we keep the halachos of Shemitah properly, then this is an assurance that we are given. Now, the most questionable source is the second source on the page, and that is one brief pasuk. The pasuk says, "Sheishes yom tavot, 6 days you shall work, uv'yom hashvi tishbos, and on the 7th day you shall rest." That's clearly referring to Shabbos. The question is, what about the last 3 words of the pasuk? Becharish uvakotzir tishbos. So in your plowing and your harvesting, you shall rest. So what does that mean, that from harvesting and from plowing you shall desist? So here we actually find a machlokas in the Gemara. This is a Gemara that appears in 2 places, in Rosh Hashanah Daf Tes Amud Aleph and Ma'id Katan Daf Gimel Amud Beis, where there's a machlokas. Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that these 3 words are actually referring to Shemitah, and it comes to tell us that there's an obligation not only to observe Shemitah, but to add a little bit on to the length of Shemitah. This is known as Tosefes Shemitah, Tosefes Shvius. And Rabbi Shmuel disagrees, and he says, no, these three words, Becharish v'Kotzir Tishbos, that from pruning and harvesting you shall desist, that it actually is in connection to Shabbos, and it's coming to teach us that the cutting of the wheat for the carbon ha'omer that was brought after Shavuos, so that's docha that was brought, at the 16th of Nisan, that pushes off Shabbos. If they don't have the wheat available for the carbon omer, so there's a special source, this source that tells us that you can cut it for the purpose of the omer, and therefore these words are apply to Shabbos and not to Shemitah. So we have 3 and maybe 4 sources in the Torah that talk about Shemitah. This 4th source that we just looked at, it seems to me that this establishes a strong connection between the idea of Shabbos and Shemitah, and that's significant because that tells us a lot about the idea of Shemitah as well, that the concept of Shemitah is really an idea of rest similar to the idea of the resting that we have on Shabbos. Okay, so this is just, if you will, some kind of an introduction about what is Shemitah, if you will. Now, it's not really reasonable or possible to cover all of the aspects that relate to the observance of Shemitah in one session. However, what I would like to do, because I get a certain amount of questions, is I'd like to try to discuss the options that are available in terms of Shemitah observance, and each one presents challenges and opportunity. Along the way, I hope to bolster or remind you of certain vocabulary that I think is valuable to have when discussing the aspects of Shemitah. There are a lot of words that are used when people discuss issues that relate to the 7th year, and it's worthwhile to know what they are. But to make sure that I, so to speak, cover the essential issue that I want to cover, I'm going to discuss, as I said, the options of what happens during the Shemitah year. So at a very basic level comes year number 7, and the farmers in Israel are now, I don't want to pardon the painful pun, but they're stuck in a little bit of a pickle, because what they can't do is, by strict Torah law, they can no longer work their fields. And not only can they no longer work their fields, they can no longer sell the produce from their fields. So if you were to look at things in a very straightforward and literalist fashion, you would say, come year number 7, and all farmers, drop your hoes, drop your rakes, no more plowing, no more planting, no more harvesting, no more picking, just leave it be. So obviously, first of all, this presents an enormous challenge to farmers, that somehow, that all of a sudden, come year number 7, they no longer have a source of income. And not only do they not have a source of income, if they just let the field sit, the field is going to experience a degree of degradation and ruin that will hurt them in the year following, and maybe several years following. So we obviously have to be concerned about the farmers, those who work in the agrarian sector, and quite frankly, we have to be concerned about making sure that there is produce that's available to eat. It's remarkable how much in my lifetime kashrus has changed, at least in my mind. When I was young, and I know for some of you this will sound sacrilegious, but when I was young, we often, you picked up a product and you looked at the ingredients, and if the ingredients were okay, then you felt you could eat the product. Today, that's no longer the case, and part of that is because the food industry has radically changed from a farm industry to a technological industry, and therefore nothing is obvious, and so many products are doctored in so many ways. There's so many examples of this. One example, just to illustrate the point that I've probably mentioned in other settings, is fresh cranberries. Cranberries are cranberries. What could be wrong with cranberries? Wrong. Everyone knows from Thanksgiving that people like red cranberry jelly. Cranberries, however, aren't always as cooperative. Sometimes cranberries grow more black than red. If you're a cranberry grower, this is not a good thing. You don't want to sell black cranberries because they don't sell well. So farmers of cranberries go into the bogs where the cranberries grow, and they take a dye, a red dye that comes from the female cochineal beetle, and they'll inject the bogs with this dye so that the cranberries, fresh cranberries that might have grown black, will now grow red. So nothing is simple when it comes to kashrus anymore, and that's why, generally speaking, you need to have a reliable kosher symbol. What's ironic is that today, because kosher is a big industry, so you now have, and I kid you not, several thousand supervising agencies, and some are more talented and more reliable than others. And then, unfortunately, there are some that are just outright corrupt, that are, and there are those that are incompetent. So now you basically need somebody to tell you if the kosher symbol is kosher. That's the world we live in. And therefore, one of the things that used to be, if you went to Israel, if you went to a restaurant, if you went to a hotel, you might ask the mashgiach about the kashrus. And years ago, the mashgiach would say, listen, the fruit and the vegetables are fine, but maybe stay away from the meat and maybe stay away from the cheese. Today, they'll tell you the meat and the cheese is fine, but stay away from the fruit and vegetables. And, I'm only half joking when I say that sometimes I wonder whether there's some conspiracy by the Pashka's Candy Factory to see to it that Jews don't eat fruits and vegetables because of issues of Trumas and Meisers and Shmittah and bugs, and so Jews won't eat fruits and vegetables. God forbid, they're at risk for getting scurvy. So this is a very serious issue, is that people want to know when they go to Israel, or if they live in Israel, what can they eat, and how can they go about eating fruits and vegetables. Fruits and vegetables are healthy. So there are several mechanisms that are in place, and each has their advantages and disadvantages. The probably the one that gets the most attention is what's known as the heter mechira. What is the heter mechira? The heter mechira is literally means the dispensation of the sale. What does that mean, the dispensation of the sale? It means that the state of Israel, what they do is they sell on behalf of the farmers, and they're careful about it. Each farm has a very carefully delineated sales sheet, which has the exact boundaries of every farm, and each farmer is approached before. The lands aren't just sold without the farmer's knowledge, and there are security measures that are put in place, and basically they take all of this land and they sell it to somebody who is not Jewish. They sell it usually to an Arab, and basically now that the land is not owned by somebody that's by Jewish, so therefore the Jew who lives there, they make an arrangement where the Jew can work the land on behalf of his non-Jewish owner and sell the produce that he has. So there are a number of objections to this idea. This, by the way, this idea really was conceived several hundred years ago, and really became an issue in the days of the old Yishuv, the old settlement in Jerusalem, the Jews were dying of starvation, and they knew that if they observed Shemitah in the classic sense, then they would really die. Uh, I mean, and I'm not exaggerating. It's hard to believe, but somebody like our beloved Rabbi Levine, his grandfather, Rabbi Aryeh Levine, lost 3 children to starvation. It's hard for us to relate to that idea, but starvation was a very real issue. So they wrote to the great scholars in Eastern Europe to ask, basically, could they rely on this idea of the heter mechira? And there was a famous letter that was signed by 3 prominent leaders. One of them was Rabbi Shula Mikutna, and they basically said that if Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, who was the chief rabbi in Kovna, was arguably the greatest sage of the generation, if he agrees, which he did, that they could rely on the heter mechira, then for this year they could rely on it, and in future years they'll assess as to whether it's permissible to rely on it. People often think that it was Rav Kook who came up with the idea of the heter mechira. Rav Kook most definitely did not come up with the idea of the heter mechira. In fact, what happened was they felt that it wouldn't be appropriate for somebody from Yerushalayim, a rabbi in Yerushalayim, to execute the heter mechira because it's too self-serving. So what they did was they got the rabbi in Akko, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Hertz, who was one of the prominent students of the Vilna Gaon, the first siddur of the Vilna Gaon, the Siddur Agra, as it's called. He was the one who put it together, and because he did not live in Yerushalayim, so he was in charge of the heter mechira. When Rav Kook took over that job and he became the Rav in Akko, so he had to also do the heter mechira. And I became the rabbi in Lower Marion Synagogue. There were certain responsibilities that came along with the job. So when Rav Kook assumed the job as chief rabbi in Akko, he had this responsibility. Rav Kook wrote a sefer about the heter mechira called Shavas Haaretz. If you read the sefer very carefully, if you read the book very carefully, you really see that Rav Kook himself had an enormous amount of hesitancy about relying on this concept. That he didn't like the idea so much, and in fact, today, if you go to Israel, so the students of Rav Kook, so they actually Merkaz Arav, they're not literally the students of Rav Kook. Rav Kook passed away many years ago, 80 years ago, but the students of Rav Kook, they don't rely on the heter mechira because they feel that Rav Kook established all of these qualifications and all these conditions, and that those qualifications and those conditions don't apply in our time. So they weren't so so they're not so comfortable with the heter mechira. But that's one approach is the heter mechira, and many people rely on the heter mechira. There's another concept known as Otzer Bezdin. Otzer Bezdin is really an idea that already appears in the Tosefta, and basically the idea works as follows. Many people consider this to be the preferred option, but the idea is that the farms and the equipment and the produce are transferred over to Bezdin in advance of Shemitah. The Bezdin subsequently hires people. They try to also intentionally include some non-Jews that will then work the fields, that they will then package the produce, and that they will bring the produce to market. And this idea has a number of advantages. Person purchases the produce from an Otzer Bezdin, so the money is not holy. If you buy fruit which has a status of holiness, in other words, it's Shemitah fruit, it has what's called kedusha shvius, the sanctity of the seventh year. We'll talk about that in a couple of moments. But here, you're not actually buying fruit which is holy, but rather you're paying what's called schar tircha. You're paying the reward for effort, and therefore it's something that's permissible. In Israel today, there are special stores that are set up that sell things that are Otzer Bezdin. There are ways that you could sign up online to purchase produce that's Otzer Bezdin. You could sort of become a member of one of these sort of Bezdin co-ops, if you will, and that's a very good way to deal with the problem. The primary issue is that is it really working the way it's supposed to? What do I mean by that? That some people feel that, yeah, if it was a genuine Otzer Bezdin, it would be perfectly fine, but it's not. What ends up happening is that basically the same people that own the fields before Shmitah are owning it now. The same people who were working the fields are working the fields. The same people who were selling the produce are selling the produce. And are they really just selling it? Are the rates of the products really being calculated on what's called schar tircha alone, just based on just to compensate them for their effort, or is there actual profit that's happening? So in a large economic system like Israel, doesn't seem to be what was envisioned in the times of the Tosefta and the times of the Mishnah, where it sort of seemed like the Bezdin hired a couple people to go out into the field and to work the farms and then bring the food to market and distribute it to people and sell it just quote unquote at cost. And that is many people feel that that's not exactly what's happening today, and therefore they cast aspersions on the Otzer Bezdin. Another approach that's taken, this is an approach that one might find in more generally speaking in Haredi circles, where people are not comfortable with the Heter Mechira and they're not comfortable with the Otzer Bezdin, is what's known as Yivul Nachri or Gidule Nachri. Yivul Nachri means the yield of non-Jews, or that which is grown by non-Jews. In other words, Shemitah only applies to Jews and to Jewish-owned lands. But if the land is not owned by Jews, then there's no problem of buying the produce. And essentially, there is Yivul Nachri that comes from Europe, which it tends to be very expensive, is not reliable. In general, people obviously, there are those who are very opposed because they feel that using this kind of a system essentially cuts the Israeli Jewish farmer out. And it just seems so odd that you could protect your monetary aspects by executing a prusbul, but when it comes to taking care of the farmer, you're basically throwing the farmer out on his ear by circumnavigating him. The bigger problem is that most of the Gidulei Nachri is actually Arabs, Arab produce in the land of Israel. So, and there are a number of issues with Gidulei Nachri, and that some are halachic and some are hashkafic. Obviously, there are those who feel that to support Arabs who might then be using these funds for criminal or terrorist purposes, that doesn't seem proper. There's a prohibition called lo sechonim. Lo sechonim means that you shall not give grace to people that are not Jewish, and that there are different halachic expressions of how lo sechonim actually plays out. But one way in which it plays out is giving them hold on the land of Israel. So here we are, if we're buying produce that was produced by Arabs, so you're giving them a hold on the land of Israel. So there are many halachic authorities who feel that that's not proper, that goes against the halacha. I will tell you also on a practical level that so often what has happened is that there are things that are sold as gidulei nachri, they're sold as non-Jewish produce, and in reality, it's Jewish produce. What happens? There are Israeli farmers who are talented farmers. Israel happens to be really at the cutting edge when it comes to issues in the agrarian society and agrarian realms, and countries all over the world turn to Israel for farming techniques. In fact, part of the reason that Israel has strong diplomatic relations with many African countries is precisely because of issues of farming and water management, where Israel is truly a leader. Israel has succeeded in turning swamps and deserts into blossoming farmlands. To see those prophecies fulfilled in our own lifetimes is truly a miracle, which we should praise Hashem for every single day. And during the Shemitah year, what all too often happens is that you have Jewish farmers who are producing, and they have no place to sell their produce. People don't want to. There are people that don't want to rely on the heter mechira, and so what they do is they sell their produce to Arab farmers, who then sell this produce and claim that the Arabs grew it, when in reality it was grown by Jews. And unfortunately, in the past two Shemitah cycles, some of the most prominent hechsherim in Israel had to admit that this problem happened. So on a practical level, that's really a problem, where the produce really did have kedusha shvius to it, and was sold off as gedulei nachri, and in reality it wasn't. So it's as a result of which each one of these mechanisms has challenges. There is at least one other mechanism that's worth considering, and that's what's known as matzah menutak. Matzah menutak essentially are greenhouses. If you have greenhouses, or if you have hydroponically grown produce, so then it's not growing in the land. So the vast majority of halachic authorities maintain that it's not subject to any of the laws of Shemitah. There is a minority position that says that if the hydroponically grown produce or the greenhouses they exist all year round, then maybe that does have a status of being part of the ground itself. Again, because of the mechira, the mechira, so maybe there's an extra form of coverage. But there is also the issue that on a practical level, these greenhouses, besides for the fact that their produce is expensive, and there are a lot of Israelis who can't afford to pay these kinds of prices, is that as the year wears on, it becomes more and more difficult. There is also another mechanism. It's unfortunately it's not as strong as it once used to be, for a reason I'll explain in a minute, and that's really a geographic concept known as Arava Dromit, Negev Maravi, and Ever Hayarden HaMizrachi. These are areas that we consider to be part of Greater Israel, but since they were not areas that were settled after the time of Bayis Sheni, so although there's a prohibition to work the lands, but the sfichim, that's the aftergrowth that grows during the seventh year, is permissible for consumption. The problem is that Israel has given away a lot of these areas. So at one point we had places like in the Sinai, like Yamit, and we had the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip it was unbelievable what was being produced there. Uh, just just in one area of the Gaza Strip, I remember I visited the those communities before they were handed over to our cousins. That I remember that 25% of all hydroponically grown, organically grown cherry tomatoes were produced in the Gaza Strip. So they were producing so much. They were producing lettuce. They were producing so many things. So those things were not subject, according to the vast majority of opinions, to kedusha shvius. So that was a very, very good solution. So there are still are some areas, certain parts of the Negev that that might be a possibility. But the biggest issue is that we don't have so many of those areas anymore. So each one of these solutions, if you will, has its challenges, and we have to figure out each one of us what we're comfortable with. And I'm happy to discuss with anybody offline the various pros and cons in greater detail if someone wishes. However, this much I feel that I would like to say, and that is that, and I realize not everybody will agree with what I'm about to say, but I have a tradition from Rav Moshe Feinstein on this issue, so I feel comfortable sharing this. When it comes to kashrus, and this is actually a din in Shulchan Aruch, that if somebody is Shabbos observant and somebody keeps kashrus, then you can rely on their kashrus and trust them. I say that because I think this particularly comes up in the area of Shemitah observance. There may be people who have their own stringencies. Some people maybe don't want to rely on the heter mechira. I don't know. Some people don't want to rely on gidulei nachri. I think if you eat at somebody else's house in Israel that and they're Shabbos observant and they keep kosher, you should rely on them. Shmiddah should be something that unifies us. It should not be something that divides us. It is, at least for me, a source of deep pain to see how much divisiveness Shmiddah causes. And I see sometimes the way that people write about these issues, and they write about different individuals and different groups of people based on what they think is the right practice. There's so many vitriolic attacks. I had somebody tell me, I don't know what to do. When I go to Israel, I have one married child that will only eat heter mechira, and I have one married child that will absolutely not eat heter mechira. So I can't eat with my children together at the same time. That's so painful. That's so hard to hear. And by the way, sadly, it's not an anomaly. It's not as unusual as you might think it is. So I would encourage people, regardless of whatever personal opinion you may have, but if you go someplace, then I think if the people are Shabbos and Kashrus observant, you should rely on them, even if you think that they have standards that are slightly different than your own. I mentioned that there's this concept called kedusha shvius, that fruits and vegetables that are grown during the seventh year have the holiness of the Shemitah year. By the way, that's one of the reasons that people are against Gidulei Nachri, is because you then spent a whole year where you didn't benefit from eating from food that had kedusha shvius, and what a shame to pass up on such a special mitzvah. But there are a couple of things to be mindful of when it comes to kedusha shvius, and that is that the food has a certain amount of holiness, and it has impact in a number of ways. First of all, food preparation. Food preparation means that you have to use the foods the way they're normally used. So a certain amount of culinary creativity might not be appropriate during the Shemitah year. Example, if you have a food that people, almost everybody eats raw, to eat it cooked is not proper, or to make some other change. Now, nowadays, I think that there's so much creativity. It's not like you have to go online and start taking a poll to see, wait, what percentage of people actually make smoothies out of kohlrabi. But if you have enough people that do it, then that's fine. But if you know that you're doing something that's very unusual, so that's something that you should not do with shvius food. You are allowed to measure food that's used for this purpose, but if you have food that's intended for normally for human consumption, you may not give it to animals. That even after it's no longer edible, if you eat, I don't know, a fruit, a vegetable, and you let it sit on your table and you didn't finish it, so you can't then say, oh, we'll just give it to the dog. Can't do that. One has to be very careful about unnecessary waste. Person just to take one bite of something and throw it away, that you're not allowed to do. It's particularly challenging with children. Children take one bite and then they don't want it anymore. They throw it on the floor. It's we have to try as much as possible to guide them. Where it's possible to sort of save the leftovers and eat them at a later point, that would be the ideal thing to do. And we should bear in mind that Kedusha Shvius applies even to things like spices. It also applies. Now, how do you get rid of this stuff if it has all of this holiness to it? So one thing that you could do is sort of give it its own glorified garbage can and let it decompose. However, you can't take other stuff and add it to that. So that can therefore take a while. But one thing that you can do is if you take something and you double wrap it and then you dispose of it, that's something that you would be allowed to be allowed to do as well. One should not take things that have kedusha shvius and turn it into medicine. Now, sometimes medicine has ingredients that have kedusha shvius in it. That's okay, but to take leftover produce and to somehow use it for medicinal purposes, that one should not do. Flowers are generally not considered to have kedusha shvius to them unless they have a very, very strong fragrant aroma. So then some authorities feel that they are subject to the laws of kedusha shvius. I want to conclude. This is really just this is, I think, an overview, I think, of the main possibilities of what to do with Shmitah, and is just to touch on kedusha shvius in a general sense. I want to address one other point that has sort of come my way, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it. I think it's a fad that has developed in the last couple of Shemitah cycles, and that is that I've seen these ads online, in newspapers and magazines. I'm sure you've seen them as well, where people say, "Oh, you should fulfill the mitzvah of Shemitah, buy a portion of land in Israel, and let it count for kedusha shvius." Now, on face value, that sounds like a really nice and exciting idea. You get yourself a pied à terre in Israel. Some farmer sells you a piece of land, and now you're fulfilling the mitzvah of Shemitah. I was happy to see that Rabbi Weiss has a tshuva. He has a sefer just on Shvius, and I saw that he has a tshuva where he writes what I wanted him to write. He says more or less what I was thinking. So I feel good that I was mechaven to what he had to say on this issue, and that is that this is a newfangled concept. That is to say, Shemitah is, as we pointed out, is an obligation for the land to rest. There's no obligation that a person has to make land rest. This is akin to saying, there's an obligation that your animals should rest on Shabbos. No, I'm going to start a new LMS campaign where, Moshe, I'll speak to you about it after the Shiur, that what we're going to do is we're going to start selling horses and donkeys, and everybody will let the horse and donkey rest on Shabbos, so you'll fulfill the mitzvah of shvisas behemto, of having your animal rest on Shabbos. It's ridiculous. If you have an animal, then you should let it rest. If you have land, so then you should let it rest during the Shemitah year. This is a mitzvah on the land. It's not a mitzvah on the person. Furthermore, when a person purchases land and basically says, I'm going to fulfill the mitzvah of Shemitah with it, what they are not doing is they're not declaring the produce of that land to be hefker, which is unfortunate, because that's really what should be done, is to declare the produce and the fruit on the land hefker, ownerless, so that people can benefit from it. And finally, and I think that this is the most important issue, is that there are farmers who are really moser nefesh. There are religious farmers who really try to keep the mitzvah of Shemitah. In years past, people understood that these farmers had a hard time during the seventh year, and they would try and support them. And there are mechanisms to support these farmers. Now people are saying, oh, you know what? I have a better idea. I'll fulfill the mitzvah of Shemitah by purchasing a piece of land and letting it sit fallow. And the result is that the poor farmer is becoming poorer. So therefore, I think on this point, even though I think it's a very well-intended idea, I really don't think that it's the best idea. The hope is that one day we will all be able to fulfill the mitzvah of Shvius properly, and that we will be able to benefit from things that have Kedusha Shvius, that we won't have the controversies and the division that we have. I believe we are coming closer to that day, but while it is, as I said, very painful to me to watch the fighting and the bickering that goes on about these issues, it underscores a remarkable development that really happens in our time. I don't know if any of you saw this, but in recent weeks, there have been a number of articles about Naftali Bennett, the Prime Minister of Israel, how he manages being a Shomer Shabbos Prime Minister of Israel. And what all of these things point to is that growing up, we know that there are 4 volumes of the Shulchan Aruch, one that deals with the halacha of day-to-day issues, one that deals like the Shabbos and Yantif and davening, that's our Chaim section. There's a section that deals with things which are permitted and prohibited, like the laws of kashrus, Yardea. There's an issue that deals with issues of marriage and divorce, etc. That's Even Ezer. And finally, a section that deals with choshen, monetary matters, choshen mishpat. But we are living in a time where more and more people live in Israel, and these complicated issues like Shemitah and religious prime ministers fall under a category that we're going to have to create a new section, and that is issues of Jewish national halacha. And that it poses a lot of challenges, but is also very exciting, and hopefully will usher in the era of Mashiach. So if anybody has any questions, you can unmute yourselves, and I'm happy to take any questions that people might have. I'm not 100% sure people can unmute themselves. Let's see if I can unmute people. Let's see, 1 second. Okay. All right. So I think people, if you want to unmute yourself, you can unmute yourself. If anybody has any questions, I'm willing to entertain questions that people may have, and I'm certainly willing to continue the conversation privately afterward with anybody. And
Rabbi?
Yes.
It's Elchanan here.
Hi, how are you?
Good. What about Israeli produce in the U.S.? I mean, exported stuff.
Okay. Very good question. I'm glad you asked that question. So you should try to look for hashgacha. A lot of the stuff does have hashgacha. A lot of the stuff that we get comes from Tenuva, and the stuff. So, and a lot of times, even if there's not an outright hashgacha, the boxes which they come in will indicate that they are from Tenuva. If they're from Tenuva, then you can presume, which is like I said, the majority of produce that comes to the U.S., then you can presume that it's okay. Rabbi Whitman actually, who's the Rav of Tenuva, and who's a Rav in Gush Etzion, I think South Gush Etzion, North, I forget which part, wrote an excellent sefer on this topic. It happens to be that there are a lot of books on Shemitah that have come out. Ironically, two of the best are two rabbis who live side by side in the Gush, one by Rabbi Whitman and one by Rav Rimon. The sefer by Rav Rimon, actually, who was a scholar resident at LMS, has also been translated into English. So I would tell you to look to see where it comes from, and that should address most of the issues. Anybody else? Okay, the Yiddish speakers that I knew growing up, so many of them came from Eastern Europe, and they lived in poverty. And when they came to North America, it was a land of good and plenty by comparison, and they had the opportunity to eat things like chicken and meat, which they didn't get to see quite as much of, many of them in Eastern Europe. So they would often speak very with great derision towards salad, and they would talk about it as Michael Behema, that's animal feed. So I think for some people that's the way they look at Shmitah, is that they don't eat Michael Behema. Okay, everyone have a wonderful evening and a wonderful Shabbos, and look forward to being able to observe this mitzvah in its completeness.
Thank you.
You are most welcome.
Thank you.